The First Punic War was the first of three wars between Rome and Carthage, the two main powers of the Western Mediterranean in the early 3rd century BCE. For 23 years, the two powers went at it hammer and tongs in the longest continuous conflict and greatest naval war of antiquity. The war was mainly fought on the Mediterranean island of Sicily and in the surrounding waters, as well as in North Africa. After suffering huge losses on both sides, the Carthaginians were defeated. Prologue. The Roman Republic had been expanding in southern Italy for about a century before the First Punic War. By 272 BCE, the Romans had conquered peninsular Italy south of the river Arno, and the Greek cities of southern Italy, Magna Graecia, had submitted at the end of the Pyrrhic War. During this period, Carthage, with its capital in what is now Tunisia, had become the dominant force in southern Spain. Much of the coastal regions of North Africa, the Balearic Islands, Corsica, Sardinia, and the western half of Sicily, in a military and commercial empire. From 480 BCE, Carthage went to war with the Greek city-states of Sicily, led by Syracuse, but the battles were inconclusive. By 264 BCE, Carthage and Rome were the top dogs in the western Mediterranean. The two states had several times shown their friendship by forming formal alliances. In 509 BCE, 348 BCE, and around 279 BCE. The relationship was good, with lots of trade going on. During the Pyrrhic War of 280-275 BCE, Carthage supported the Romans against a king of Epirus, who was fighting both Rome in Italy and Carthage on Sicily. Carthage provided the Romans with supplies and, on at least one occasion, used its navy to ferry a Roman force. In 289 BCE, a group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines, who had been hired by Syracuse, took over the city of Messana, modern Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily. Facing pressure from Syracuse, the Mamertines asked both Rome and Carthage for help in 265 BCE. The Carthaginians got things moving first, persuading Hieroseku, king of Syracuse, to back off and convincing the Mamertines to accept a Carthaginian garrison. According to Polybius, there was a lot of debate in Rome about whether to accept the Mamertines' appeal for assistance. As the Carthaginians had already garrisoned Messana, accepting could easily lead to war with Carthage. The Romans hadn't shown any interest in Sicily before, and didn't want to help soldiers who'd taken a city from its rightful owners. But many saw strategic and financial benefits in gaining a foothold in Sicily. The Roman Senate, possibly at the instigation of Appius Claudius Caudex, put the matter before the popular assembly in 264 BCE. Caudex encouraged a vote for action and promised a lot of loot. The popular assembly decided to accept the Mamertines' request. Caudex was appointed commander of a military expedition with orders to cross to Sicily and place a Roman garrison in Messina. The First Punic War began with the Romans landing on Sicily in 264 BCE. Despite the Carthaginian naval advantage, the Romans managed to cross the Strait of Messina despite some opposition. Two Roman legions led by Caudex marched to Messana, where the Mamertines had expelled the Carthaginian garrison, which was under the command of Hanno, no relation to Hanno the Great, and were besieged by both the Carthaginians and the Syracusans. The sources are unclear as to why, but first the Syracusans, and then the Carthaginians, withdrew from the siege. The Romans marched south and laid siege to Syracuse, but they didn't have the manpower or supply lines to keep up the pressure. They soon pulled out. The Carthaginians had learned from experience that it was impossible to win a war on Sicily. After heavy losses and huge expense, military efforts petered out. The Carthaginian leaders expected this war to be no different. Meanwhile, their overwhelming maritime superiority would allow the war to be kept at a distance, and even for them to continue to prosper. This would allow them to recruit and pay an army that would operate in the open against the Romans, while their strongly fortified cities could be supplied by sea and provide a defensive base from which to operate. Battle of Messana. The Battle of Messana in 264 BCE was the first military clash between the Roman Republic and Carthage. This marked the start of the First Punic War. After the recent successes in southern Italy, Sicily became more and more important to Rome as a strategic location. Syracuse defects. The Romans had a long-standing procedure of appointing 2 men each year, known as consuls, to lead armies. In 263 BCE, both were sent to Sicily with a force of 40,000. Syracuse was again besieged, and without any help from Carthage, the city made peace with the Romans. It became an ally of Rome, paid an indemnity of 100 talents of silver, and agreed to help supply the Roman army in Sicily. Battle of Agrigentum. The Battle of Agrigentum, Sicily 262 BCE, was the first big battle of the First Punic War, and the first time Carthage and the Roman Republic faced off in a real fight. The battle came after a long siege that started in 262 BCE and resulted in a Roman victory and the start of Roman control of Sicily. Siege of Agrigento. After Syracuse defected, several smaller Carthaginian territories switched sides. Acragas, a port city on the south coast of Sicily, was chosen by the Carthaginians as their main base. The Romans marched on it in 262 BCE and besieged it. The Romans had a pretty weak supply system, partly because the Carthaginian navy was so strong that they couldn't ship supplies by sea, and they weren't used to feeding an army as big as 40,000 men. At harvest time, most of the army was spread out over a wide area to harvest crops and forage. The Carthaginians, led by Hannibal Barca, launched a major attack, catching the Romans off guard and pushing deep into their camp. The Romans regrouped and drove the Carthaginians out. After this, both sides were more cautious. Rome builds a fleet. The war in Sicily reached a stalemate because the Carthaginians focused on defending their well-fortified towns and cities. These were mostly on the coast, so the Romans couldn't use their superior army to interdict. The focus of the war shifted to the sea, where the Romans had little experience. They'd previously relied on small squadrons provided by their Latin or Greek allies when they felt the need for a naval presence. According to Polybius, the Romans seized a shipwrecked Carthaginian quinquereme and used it as a blueprint for their own ships. The new fleets were led by the yearly elected Roman magistrates, but the sailors were trained by the lower officers, who were mostly Greeks. This practice continued until well into the empire, as shown by the many Greek naval terms that were used. As inexperienced shipbuilders, the Romans made copies that were heavier than the Carthaginian vessels, so they were slower and less maneuverable. Carthage had also recruited an army, which assembled in Africa and was shipped to Sicily. It was made up of 50,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 60 elephants, and was commanded by Hanno, son of Hannibal. It was partly made up of Ligurians, Celts, and Iberians. 5 months after the siege began, Hanno marched to Acragas's relief. When he arrived, he just set up camp on high ground, engaged in some light skirmishing, and trained his army. 2 months later, in spring 261 BCE, he attacked. The Carthaginians were defeated with heavy losses at the Battle of Acragas. The Romans, with both consuls in charge, Lucius Postumius Megellus and Quintus Mamilius Vitulus, kept up the chase, capturing the Carthaginians' elephants and baggage train. That night, the Carthaginian garrison made a break for it while the Romans were otherwise engaged. The next day, the Romans took the city and its inhabitants, selling 25,000 of them into slavery. Naval engagements Battle of the Lipari Islands. The Battle of the Lipari Islands, also known as the Battle of Lipara, was a naval clash that took place in 260 BCE during the First Punic War. A squadron of 20 Carthaginian ships, led by Bodes, caught 17 Roman ships under the senior consul for the year, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, off the coast of Lipara harbor. The inexperienced Romans didn't do so well with all 17 of their ships captured. along with their commander. The Romans had recently built a fleet to challenge the Carthaginians' control of the western Mediterranean, and Scipio had gone to Lipara with the advance squadron without thinking things through. The battle was pretty much just a skirmish, but it's notable as the first naval encounter of the Punic Wars and the first time Roman warships had engaged in battle. Scipio was ransomed after the battle and was known as Asina, Latin for female donkey, from then on. Battle of Mylae. The Battle of Mylae took place in 260 BCE during the First Punic War and was the first real naval battle between Carthage and the Roman Republic. This battle was a key factor in the Roman victory at Mylae, modern-day Milazzo, as well as Sicily itself. It was also Rome's first naval victory and the first time the corvus was used in battle. After Acragas. After this success for the Romans, the war became fragmented for several years, with minor successes for each side, but no clear focus. This was partly because the Romans diverted many of their resources to an ultimately fruitless campaign against Corsica and Sardinia, and then into the equally fruitless expedition to Africa. After taking Acragas, the Romans advanced westward to besiege Mytistraton for 7 months, without success. In 259 BCE, they advanced toward Thermae on the north coast. After a disagreement, the Roman troops and their allies set up separate camps. Hamilcar took advantage of this to launch a counterattack, taking one of the contingents by surprise as it was breaking camp and killing 6,000. Hamilcar then took Enna in central Sicily and Camarina in the southeast, which was dangerously close to Syracuse. It seemed like he was close to overrunning the whole of Sicily. The following year, the Romans retook Enna and finally captured Mytistraton. They then moved on to Panormus, modern Palermo, but had to withdraw, although they did capture Hippana. In 258 BCE, they recaptured Camarina after a long siege. For the next few years, there were still some raids, skirmishes, and even a few towns defecting from one side to the other. Battle of Solsi. The Battle of Solsi was a naval battle fought in 258 BCE between the Roman and Carthaginian navies on the coast near the town of Solsi, Sardinia. The Romans came out on top thanks to the efforts of Consul Gaius Sulpicius Paterculus. The Carthaginian fleet was pretty much destroyed, and the rest of the ships were left on land. The Carthaginian commander Hannibal Gisco was killed by his own army, either crucified or stoned. The Romans were defeated by a certain Hanno in Sardinia, and the Roman attempt to capture the island failed. The loss of ships meant the Carthaginians couldn't mount any major operations from Sardinia against the Romans. Battle of Tyndaris. The Battle of Tyndaris was a naval battle of the First Punic War that took place off Tyndaris, modern Tindari, in 257 BCE. Tyndaris was a town in Sicily that was founded as a Greek colony in 396 BCE. It was located on high ground overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea in the Gulf of Patti. Hiero II, the tyrant of Syracuse, let the Carthaginians use Tyndaris as a base. The battle took place in the waters between Tyndaris and the Aeolian Islands, with Gaius Atilius Regulus in command of the Roman fleet. After that, the town fell to Rome. The Battle of Cape Ecnomus, also known as the Battle of Ecnomos, was a naval battle fought off southern Sicily in 256 BCE between the fleets of Carthage and the Roman Republic. It was part of the First Punic War, 264–241 BCE. The Carthaginian fleet was led by Hanno and Hamilcar, while the Roman fleet was commanded by the consuls for the year, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus. The Romans came out on top. The Roman fleet, which included 330 warships and an unknown number of transports, had set sail from Ostia, the port of Rome. They had embarked approximately 26,000 picked legionaries shortly before the battle. Their plan was to cross to Africa and invade the Carthaginian homeland, which is now Tunisia. The Carthaginians knew what the Romans were up to and got all their warships, 350, off the south coast of Sicily to intercept them. With a combined total of about 680 warships, carrying up to 290,000 crew and marines, this was probably the largest naval battle in history by the number of combatants involved. When the fleets met, the Carthaginians took the initiative, and the battle split into 3 separate conflicts. They were hoping that their superior ship-handling skills would win the day. After a long and confusing day of fighting, the Carthaginians were soundly defeated, losing 30 ships and 64 captured to Roman losses of 24 ships. Invasion of Africa. The Romans' invention of the corvus, a device that made it easier for them to board enemy vessels, helped them defeat the Carthaginians in large naval battles at Mylae, 260 BCE, and Sulci, 257 BCE. The Romans were encouraged by these victories and frustrated by the continuing stalemate in Sicily. They changed their focus to a sea-based strategy and developed a plan to invade the Carthaginian heartland in North Africa and threaten Carthage, close to Tunis. Both sides were determined to establish naval supremacy and invested a lot of money and manpower in maintaining and increasing the size of their navies. The Roman fleet of 330 warships, plus an unknown number of transport ships, set sail from Ostia, the port of Rome, in early 256 BCE. It was commanded by the consuls for the year, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus. They set sail with about 26,000 of the best Roman legionaries from Sicily. Their plan was to cross to Africa and invade what is now Tunisia. The siege of Aspis, also known as Clupea, took place in 255 BCE between Carthage and the Roman Republic. It was the first fighting on African soil during the First Punic War. The Romans set up a trench and palisade to defend their ships and then moved in to besiege Aspis. Carthage wasn't ready to fight on land, so the city fell after the garrison put up a brief resistance. By taking Clupea, the Romans controlled the area of land opposite Carthage and secured their rear, giving them the advantage to scout out the enemy. The Romans forced Aspis to surrender and left a proper garrison in place. They sent some messengers to Rome to let them know what had happened, and to get instructions on what to do next. They then left with all their troops and went through the country to loot it. Once they'd beaten the Carthaginians, the Romans sent most of their fleet back to Rome, leaving just 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry behind. The rest of the army, under the command of Marcus Atilius Regulus, stayed in North Africa. As they advanced inland and plundered the territory along the way, they stopped at the city of Attis. The siege of Attis gave the Carthaginians time to gather an army, but that army was defeated at the Battle of Attis. Regulus advances towards Carthage. The Battle of Attis was fought between a Carthaginian army led by Bostar, Hamilcar, and Hasdrubal, and a Roman army led by Marcus Atilius Regulus. Earlier in the year, the new Roman navy established naval superiority and used this to invade the Carthaginian homeland, which roughly aligned with modern Tunisia in North Africa. After landing on the Cape Bon Peninsula and having a pretty successful campaign, the fleet went back to Sicily. Regulus was left with 5,500 men to hold the fort in Africa over the winter. Instead of holding his position, Regulus advanced towards the Carthaginian capital, Carthage. The Carthaginian army set up camp on a rocky hill near Attis, modern Uthina, where Regulus was trying to take the town. Regulus had his troops march at night to launch 2 attacks on the Carthaginians' fortified hilltop camp in the morning. One part of the force was pushed back and chased down the hill. The other part then charged the Carthaginians in the rear and routed them. At this, the Carthaginians left in the camp panicked and fled. The Romans advanced to Tunis, which was only 16 kilometers, 10 miles from Carthage. Carthage sues for peace. The Romans followed up and captured Tunis, only 16 kilometers, 10 miles from Carthage. From Tunis, the Romans carried out further raids and devastated the area around Carthage. In despair, the Carthaginians asked for peace, but Regulus made such harsh demands that they decided to fight on. The Spartan mercenary commander Xanthippus was put in charge of training the army. Roman reversal Ued Megerda, Tunisia. In the spring of 255 BCE, Xanthippus led an army with lots of cavalry and elephants against the Romans' infantry-based force. The Romans didn't have a good answer for the elephants. The Carthaginian cavalry chased the outnumbered Roman cavalry from the field and surrounded most of the Romans, wiping them out. Only 500 survived and were captured, including Regulus. A force of 2,000 Romans managed to avoid being surrounded and retreated to Aspis. The war went on for another 14 years, mostly on Sicily or in nearby waters, before the Romans finally won. The terms they offered to Carthage were more generous than those proposed by Regulus. Rome withdraws Cape Bon, Tunisia. Later in 255 BCE, the Romans sent a fleet of 350 quinqueremes and more than 300 transports to evacuate their survivors, who were under siege in Aspis. Both consuls for the year, Servius Fulvius Petinus Nobilior and Marcus Aemilius Paulus, went with the fleet. They captured the island of Caesarea on the way. The Carthaginians tried to stop the evacuation with 200 quinqueremes. They caught up with the Romans off Cape Hermaeum, which is now called Cape Bon or Ras ed Dar, a little to the north of Aspis. The 40 Roman ships that had been left to support Regulus's force over the winter set sail from Aspis to join the fight. Not much is known about the battle. The Carthaginians were worried they'd be trapped by the larger Roman fleet, so they sailed close to the coast. However, the Carthaginian ships were outmaneuvered and forced to beach. Many were boarded via the Corvus and captured. The Carthaginians were defeated and 113 of their ships were captured, along with their crews, and 16 sunk. We don't know how many Romans were killed or wounded. Most modern historians think there were no Roman casualties. The historian Mark DeSantis reckons that the Carthaginians didn't have as many Marines on their ships as the Romans did, which might have been a factor in their defeat and the large number of vessels captured. Storm wrecks Roman fleet. The Roman fleet was pretty badly hit by a storm while returning to Italy. 384 ships were sunk from their total of 464, and 100,000 men lost, the majority of whom were non-Roman Latin allies. It's possible that the Corvus made the Roman ships less seaworthy than usual. There's no record of them being used after this disaster. Carthaginians capture Acragas. In 254 BCE, the Carthaginians attacked and captured Acragas, but they didn't think they could hold the city, so they burned it, razed its walls, and left. Romans in Africa again. In 253 BCE, the Romans shifted their focus back to Africa and carried out a few more raids. Another 150 ships were lost from a fleet of 220 when a storm hit while they were returning from raiding the North African coast east of Carthage. They got the ships back up and running again. Roman victory in Panormus. In late summer 251 BCE, the Carthaginian commander Hasdrubal, who had faced Regulus in Africa, heard that one consul had left Sicily for the winter with half of the Roman army. He advanced on Panormus and devastated the countryside. The Roman army, which had been sent out to collect the harvest, retreated into Panormus. Hasdrubal led most of his army, including the elephants, straight for the city walls. Lucius Caecilius Metellus, the Roman commander, sent out some skirmishers to keep the Carthaginians on their toes. They kept them supplied with javelins from the stocks within the city. The ground was covered with earthworks that had been built during the Roman siege, making it difficult for the elephants to advance. The elephants were hit with missiles and couldn't fight back, so they ran through the Carthaginian infantry behind them. Metellus had moved a large force to the Carthaginians' left flank, and they charged into their opponents, who were in disarray. The Carthaginians ran away, and Metellus captured 10 elephants, but didn't pursue them. There's no mention of casualties in the contemporary accounts, and modern historians think the later claims of 20,000, 30,000 Carthaginian casualties are unlikely. Siege of Lilybaeum. The siege of Lilybaeum lasted for 9 years, from 250 to 241 BCE, as the Roman army laid siege to the Carthaginian-held Sicilian city of Lilybaeum, modern Marsala, during the First Punic War. The war between Rome and Carthage had been going on since 264 BCE, with most of the fighting taking place on the island of Sicily or in the surrounding waters. The Romans were slowly pushing the Carthaginians back. By 250 BCE, the Carthaginians were down to just the cities of Lilybaeum and Drepana. These were well fortified and situated on the west coast, making it easy for them to be supplied and reinforced by sea without the Romans being able to use their superior army to interfere. In mid-250 BCE, the Romans besieged Lilybaeum with more than 100,000 men, but an attempt to storm Lilybaeum failed, and the siege became a stalemate. The Romans then tried to destroy the Carthaginian fleet, but the Roman fleet was destroyed in the naval battles of Drepana and Fintius. The Carthaginians kept supplying the city from the sea. 9 years later, in 242 BCE, the Romans built a new fleet and stopped the Carthaginian shipments. The Carthaginians rebuilt their fleet and sent it to Sicily, loaded with supplies. The Romans met the Carthaginians not far from Lilybaeum, and at the Battle of the Aegates in 241 BCE, the Romans defeated the Carthaginian fleet. The Carthaginians asked for peace, and the war ended after 23 years, with the Romans coming out on top. The Carthaginians still held Lilybaeum, but as part of the Treaty of Lutatius, they had to withdraw their forces from Sicily and evacuate the city that same year. Battle of Panormus. The Battle of Panormus was fought in Sicily in 250 BCE during the First Punic War between a Roman army led by Lucius Caecilius Metellus and a Carthaginian force led by Hasdrubal, son of Hanno. The Roman army, made up of 2 legions, managed to defeat the much larger Carthaginian army of 30,000 men and between 60 and 142 war elephants. The war started in 264 BCE, with Carthage controlling most of Sicily, where most of the fighting took place. In 255 BCE, the Romans tried to attack the city of Carthage in North Africa, but were soundly defeated by a Carthaginian army that was strong in cavalry and elephants. When the war shifted back to Sicily, the Romans captured the big and important city of Panormus in 254 BCE. After that, they avoided battle because they were afraid of the war elephants that the Carthaginians had shipped to Sicily. In late summer, 250 BCE, Hasdrubal led his army to attack the crops of the cities that were allied with Rome. The Romans retreated to Panormus, and Hasdrubal advanced towards the city walls. Once he got to Panormus, Metellus started fighting back. He countered the elephants with a hail of javelins from earthworks dug near the walls. The elephants panicked and fled through the Carthaginian infantry under the hail of missiles. The Romans then charged the Carthaginians on their left flank, which broke, and the rest of the Carthaginians with it. The elephants were captured and later killed in the Circus Maximus. This was the last big land battle of the war, which ended 9 years later with the Romans winning. The siege of Drepana took place from about 249 to 241 BCE during the First Punic War. Drepana, which is now Trapani, and Lilybaeum, which is now Marsala, were 2 Carthaginian naval strongholds at the western end of Sicily that came under a long Roman attack. At the start of the siege, the Carthaginians won a naval battle against the Roman Republic at the Battle of Drepana. This broke the Roman naval blockade and allowed the Carthaginians to support the 2 besieged ports by sea. Access to Drepana by land was limited by the presence of Mount Eryx, so both armies fought over whether they could get to Drepana by land, but the Romans eventually won. In 241 BCE, the Romans, led by Gaius Lutatius Catulus, had rebuilt their fleet and intensified their siege of Drepana, forcing the Carthaginians to send a fleet to support the town. The Carthaginian fleet was intercepted and destroyed by the newly built Roman fleet during the Battle of the Aegates Islands, effectively ending the First Punic War. Battle of Drepana. The Naval Battle of Drepana, or Drepanum, took place in 249 BCE during the First Punic War near Drepana, modern Trapani, in western Sicily. It was between a Carthaginian fleet under Hannibal and a Roman fleet commanded by Publius Claudius Pulcher. Pulcher was blockading the Carthaginian stronghold of Lilybaeum, modern Marsala, when he decided to attack their fleet, which was in the harbor of the nearby city of Drepana. The Roman fleet set sail at night to launch a surprise attack, but got lost in the dark. Hannibal managed to get his fleet out to sea before it was trapped in the harbor. He gained some space to maneuver and then counterattacked. The Romans were trapped on the shore and were badly beaten by the Carthaginian ships, which were more maneuverable and had better crews. This was Carthage's greatest naval victory of the war. After Drepana, they turned to the maritime offensive and almost wiped out the Romans at sea. It was 7 years before Rome tried again to field a big fleet, while Carthage put most of its ships into reserve to save money and free up manpower. Battle of Phintias. The Naval Battle of Phintias took place in 249 BCE during the First Punic War near modern Licata, southern Sicily, between the fleets of Carthage under Carthalo and the Roman Republic under Lucius Junius Pullus. The Carthaginian fleet had caught up with the Roman fleet off Phintias and forced it to seek shelter. Carthalo, who listened to his pilots and decided to head east to avoid the bad weather, retired to the east to avoid the coming weather. The Roman fleet didn't take any precautions and was destroyed, with the loss of all but 2 ships. The Carthaginians took advantage of their victory by raiding the coasts of Roman Italy until 243 BCE. The Romans didn't launch a major naval operation until 242 BCE. Romans besieged Lilybaeum. After their victory at Panormus, the Romans moved against the main Carthaginian base on Sicily, Lilybaeum, in 249 BCE. A big army, led by the year's consuls Publius Claudius Pulcher and Lucius Junius Pullus, laid siege to the city. They'd rebuilt their fleet and had 200 ships blockading the harbor. At the start of the blockade, 50 Carthaginian quinqueremes gathered off the Aegates Islands, which are about 1540 kilometers, 9 to 25 miles west of Sicily. Once the wind picked up, they sailed into Lilybaeum before the Romans could react and unloaded reinforcements and a lot of supplies. They managed to get away from the Romans by leaving at night and evacuating the Carthaginian cavalry. The Romans blocked the landward approach to Lilybaeum with earth and timber camps and walls. They tried to block the harbor entrance with a heavy timber boom a few times, but the sea conditions made this impossible. The Carthaginian garrison was kept supplied by blockade runners, light and maneuverable quinqueremes with highly trained crews and experienced pilots. By 248 BCE, the Carthaginians had only 2 cities left on Sicily, Lilybaeum and Drepana. These were well fortified and situated on the west coast, where they could be supplied and reinforced without the Romans being able to use their superior army to interfere. After more than 20 years of war, both states were financially and demographically exhausted. There's evidence that Carthage was struggling financially. They asked Ptolemaic Egypt for a 2,000 talent loan, but it was turned down. Rome was also on the brink of bankruptcy, and the number of adult male citizens who provided the manpower for the navy and the legions had declined by 17% since the start of the war. Goldsworthy calls Roman manpower losses pretty bad. Hamilcar Barca takes charge. Hamilcar took over in the summer of 247 BCE and dealt with the rebellious mercenaries who had revolted because of overdue payments by killing some of them at night and drowning the rest at sea, and letting many go to different parts of northern Africa. With a smaller army and fleet, Hamilcar got to work. The Romans had split up their forces. Consul L. Caelius Metellus was near Lilybaeum, while Numerius Fabius Buteo was besieging Drepanum at the time. It seems that Hamilcar fought an inconclusive battle at Drepanum, but there's a chance this isn't true. Next, Hamilcar raided Locri in Bruttium and the area around Brindisi in 247 BCE. On his return, he seized a strong position on Mount Ercte, Monte Pellegrino, just north of Palermo, or Mount Castellazzo, 7 miles northwest of Palermo. He not only maintained himself against all attacks, but carried on with his seaborne raids, ranging from Catana in Sicily to Cumae in central Italy. He also worked to improve the army's spirit and succeeded in creating a highly disciplined and versatile force. While Hamilcar didn't win any major battles or recapture any cities lost to the Romans, he kept up a relentless campaign against the enemy, which took a constant toll on Roman resources. However, Hamilcar didn't manage to recapture Panormus as he'd hoped. The Roman forces, led by the consuls Marcus Otacilius Crassus and Marcus Fabius Licinus, achieved little against Hamilcar in 246 BCE, and the consuls of 245 BCE, Marcus Fabius Bueto and Attilius Bulbus, fared no better. In 244 BCE, Hamilcar moved his army by sea at night to a similar position on the slopes of Mount Eryx, Monte San Giuliano. This allowed him to support the besieged garrison in the neighboring town of Drepanum, Trapani. Hamilcar took the town of Eryx, which the Romans had captured in 249 BCE, after destroying the Roman garrison. He then positioned his army between the Roman forces at the summit and their camp at the base of the mountain. Hamilcar moved the locals to Drepana. Hamilcar kept up his activities from his position for another 2 years, being supplied by road from Drepana. By this time, Carthaginian ships had been withdrawn from Sicily, and no naval raids were launched. During one of the raids, troops under a subordinate commander named Bodostor were plundering against Hamilcar's orders and suffered severe casualties when the Romans caught up to them. Hamilcar requested a truce to bury his dead. Roman consul Fundanius, 243-2 BCE, replied that Hamilcar should ask for a truce to save his men, and refused the request. Hamilcar managed to inflict severe casualties on the Romans soon after, and when the Roman consul requested a truce to bury his dead, Hamilcar replied that his quarrel was with the living only, and the dead had already settled their dues, and granted the truce. Hamilcar's actions and immunity to defeat, plus the stalemate at the siege of Lilybaeum, caused the Romans to start building a fleet in 243 BCE to seek a decision at sea. However, the constant skirmishing without ultimate victory may have caused the morale of some of Hamilcar's troops to crack. In fact, 1,000 Celtic mercenaries tried to betray the Punic camp to the Romans, but this was foiled. Hamilcar had to offer his troops some pretty good incentives to keep morale up, which ended up being a major problem for Carthage later on. Rome builds a new fleet. In late 243 BCE, the Senate decided to build a new fleet because they realized they wouldn't capture Drepana and Lilybaeum unless they could extend their blockade to the sea. With the state's coffers empty, the Senate asked Rome's wealthiest citizens for loans to finance the construction of one ship each, to be repaid from the reparations to be imposed on Carthage once the war was won. The result was a fleet of around 200 quinqueremes, built, equipped, and crewed without any government expense. The Romans based their new fleet on a captured blockade runner with some great features. By now, the Romans had plenty of experience in shipbuilding, and they used a proven vessel as a model to produce high-quality quinqueremes. What's more, the corvus was ditched, which upped the speed and handling of the ships, but meant the Romans had to change their tactics. They needed to be better sailors than soldiers to beat the Carthaginians. Battle of the Agates. The Battle of the Agates was a naval battle fought on 10th of March 241 BCE between the fleets of Carthage and Rome during the First Punic War. It took place among the Agates Islands, off the western coast of Sicily. The Carthaginians were led by Hanno, while the Romans were under the overall command of Gaius Lutatius Catulus. However, Quintus Valerius Falto was in charge during the battle. This was the final and most important battle of the 23-year First Punic War. The Roman army had been blockading the Carthaginians in their last strongholds on the west coast of Sicily for several years. The Romans were almost bankrupt, so they borrowed money to build a naval fleet. They used this to extend the blockade to the sea. The Carthaginians put together a bigger fleet to bring supplies into Sicily. It would then send most of the Carthaginian army stationed there as marines. The Roman fleet caught up with the Carthaginian fleet in a tough fight. The Romans were better trained and managed to beat the Carthaginians, who were undermanned and hadn't yet brought their full complement of marines. The war ended there. The Romans kept up their land operations in Sicily, going after Lilybaeum and Drepana. The Carthaginian Senate wasn't keen on spending the money to build another fleet and man it. Instead, it told Hamilcar to negotiate a peace treaty with the Romans, which he left up to his subordinate Gisco. The Treaty of Lutatius was signed, bringing the First Punic War to an end. Carthage left Sicily, handed over all prisoners taken during the war, and paid an indemnity of 3,200 talents over 10 years. Epilogue. The war lasted 23 years, the longest war in Romano-Greek history, and the greatest naval war of the ancient world. After the war, Carthage tried to avoid paying the foreign troops who fought for them in full. Eventually, they rebelled and were joined by many other unhappy locals. They were put down with great difficulty and a lot of violence. In 237 BCE, Carthage launched an expedition to reclaim the island of Sardinia, which had been lost to the rebels. The Romans said they saw this as an act of war. The peace terms were that they had to give up Sardinia and Corsica and pay an extra 1,200 talents in compensation. After 30 years of war, Carthage agreed to the terms rather than risk another conflict with Rome. The additional payment and the renunciation of Sardinia and Corsica were added to the treaty as a codicil. These moves by Rome made Carthage even more resentful, and they didn't see eye to eye with Rome on how things were going. This is thought to have contributed to the start of the Second Punic War. Hamilcar Barca's role in defeating the mutinous foreign troops and African rebels was a major boost for the Barcid family, both in terms of prestige and power. In 237 BCE, Hamilcar led many of his veterans on an expedition to expand Carthaginian holdings in southern Iberia, modern Spain. Over the next 20 years, this became a semi-autonomous Barcid fiefdom and the source of a lot of the silver used to pay the large indemnity owed to Rome. The end of the First Punic War marked the start of Rome's expansion beyond the Italian peninsula. Sicily became the first Roman province as Sicilia, with a former praetor in charge. Sicily was important to Rome as a source of grain. Ardennia and Corsica, combined, also became a Roman province and a source of grain, under a praetor, although a strong military presence was needed for at least the next 7 years, as the Romans struggled to suppress the local inhabitants. Syracuse was given the status of an independent ally for the rest of Hiero II's life. From then on, Rome was the top military power in the Western Mediterranean, and it was getting more and more dominant in the whole Mediterranean region. The Romans had built more than 1,000 galleys during the war, and this experience of building, manning, training, supplying, and maintaining such numbers of ships laid the foundation for Rome's maritime dominance for 600 years. The question of which state would control the Western Mediterranean was still up in the air. When Carthage besieged the Roman-protected town of Saguntum in eastern Iberia in 218 BCE, it sparked the Second Punic War with Rome.
We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.